I'm happy to say that I think I'm in the running for this year's awards, and I'm really holding my breath. I'm going to speak to you today about Britain. Britain is basically caught in a pincer movement between the two arms of the global jihad, the terrorist arm and the cultural arm. Britain is only now, even after 9/11, even after the 7/7 bombings in July 2005, only now slowly actually waking up to the fact that it has a terrorist threat of the scale and nature that it does, but it is still in a state of confusion over the cultural threat. You may have read or heard of our debate recently in Britain over the niqab, the wearing of the full-face veil by Muslim women. And the remarkable thing about this debate was that it occurred at all, and that it occurred with such ferocity and passion. It was as if a dam had burst, because for all these years, Britons have been told that they cannot discuss Islamic practices and criticize them for fear of being labeled Islamophobic, prejudiced against religion. So that was a good development. I had some queries myself about precisely how that debate was conducted, but basically the fact the debate was held was a very positive development. On the other hand, we also had very recently the trial of Nick Griffin, who is the leader of Britain's most racist and nearest thing we have to a neo-fascist party, the British National Party. Griffin was not on trial for his fascist ideas. He was on trial for inciting racial hatred by saying Islam was a wicked religion. Some conceptual confusion there. The jury didn't buy it. The jury will have no truck with people being prosecuted for saying Islam is a wicked religion, because the jury probably agrees with this. So the jury slung out the prosecution, and Griffin was acquitted. The disturbing thing was, not only this prosecution was brought, but the disturbing thing was that our current Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown, who is the man most likely to succeed Tony Blair as Prime Minister, as leader of the Labour Party and Prime Minister, said that he proposed to strengthen the law to make sure that anyone who said Islam was a religion, was a wicked religion, would be prosecuted successfully and convicted. In other words, reviving this great debate which Janet's referred to that we had about criminalising the incitement to religious hatred, which basically boils down to saying that if somebody like me says that there is such a thing as Islamic terrorism, I can be called inciting, I can be accused of inciting religious hatred. So this is troubling, to put it mildly, and it means that we still have a climate of denial. This is Britain, where in the 1990s, as remarkable as this may seem, Britain became the most significant hub for al-Qaeda terror in Europe, mainly because of its state of denial about the Islamist threat. Well, we now accept that there is an Islamic threat, as we heard from Janet, these terrifying figures about the numbers who are currently under suspicion in Britain's 2 million strong or so Muslim community, out of a population, to put it in context, of some 60 million souls. So we accept in Britain that there is a terrorist threat of considerable size. We won't accept, however, what the cause is. We find all sorts of excuses still for the cause of the fact that we have all these young Muslims who are born and bred in Britain but are turning into people who wish to murder large numbers of their fellow British citizens. And we say the reason for that is because of Islamophobia. The reason for that is because of discrimination. The reason for that is because of poverty. The reason for that is because, above all, we have supported America in the war in Iraq. What we won't accept is that this is, which I think is personally demonstrably true, we are in the throes of a global religious war designed to Islamicize those parts of the world which are not already Islamic. We don't realize in Britain that our British Muslims have been radicalized by British institutions set up by the Muslim community as far back as the 1980s. These institutions were set up by people who had come in from Pakistan. We didn't realize that Pakistan had already been radicalized to the jihad by Saudi Wahhabism. Therefore, these institutions, these Muslim institutions, educational institutions, cultural institutions set up in the 1980s were actually preaching Wahhabism, were preaching hatred of the West, and a whole generation and subsequent generations of young Muslims have been born and bred into this society which has radicalized them to hatred of the West. We don't realize in Britain the scale of the Muslim Brotherhood program to Islamize Europe. We think we have no idea. There's virtually no discussion of this whatsoever. People in Britain are almost entirely unaware, for example, that in 1978 the Organization of the Islamic Conference in London decided to set up institutions in Britain financed by Muslim states around the world to lobby for recognition of Islam as a separate religious entity, in other words, Sharia law, and this was one step towards the full politicized, towards the full political program of the Islamization of Britain. We think in Britain that the problem is that our Muslims don't feel properly British. Have we got this wrong? They feel so British, they really do feel British. They feel so British, they think that Britain should become Islamic. That is the problem, and we simply have got this the wrong way around. And that is because in Britain we are incapable of seeing the world through anything other than our own eyes. It is an example of liberal hubris. We can only see the world through the liberal prism. We cannot see the world through the prism of people who really do not come from that tradition whatsoever. We cannot understand in Britain the perspective of people whose worldview is answerable not to reason, not to the rule of facts, but to irrationality, prejudice, and bigotry. Now, I have to say there are many truly moderate Muslims in Britain. This is a controversial thing to say, I know in some circles, but I believe it to be true, and I'll define what I mean in a moment. But there is nevertheless a huge number who are not, and as we heard just from Janet, the numbers who believe, for example, in the primacy of Sharia law and so on. The problem we have in Britain is that our establishment has effectively redefined what it is to be a moderate Muslim. I believe there are moderate Muslims, but our establishment says that the majority are moderate, and they mean something quite different. What do they mean? By a moderate Muslim, they mean a Muslim who does not intend or support or will promote the murder of fellow Britons. That's it. If you are a Muslim who supports the jihad across the world, if you are a Muslim who supports the fight against the coalition in Iraq, who supports suicide bombings in Israel, that doesn't make you any less a moderate, because that's just resistance. So we have the phenomenon of our establishment believing that Sheikh Qaradawi, of whom you've just heard from Robert, the man who says it's a religious duty to commit suicide bombings in Israel and to blow up the coalition forces in Iraq, Sheikh Qaradawi is regarded, or has been regarded until now by our British political and security establishment, as not simply a moderate, but actually as a role model. Why? Because Sheikh Qaradawi says it's a tactical error for Al-Qaeda to blow up Britain. Therefore, he's a man with whom we can do business. This is what the British call pragmatism. You might have a rather different word for it. So we've heard about the extreme views of Muslims, and I can add to that, just to make you even more aware of what problem we have. Nearly half think that 9/11 was a conspiracy between the United States and Israel. 46% think the Jewish community is in league with the Freemasons to control the media and politics. And 37% of British Muslims believe that the Jewish community in Britain is a legitimate target as part of the ongoing struggle for justice in the Middle East. Personally, I see the problem as this. We have a kind of continuum of extremism. If you think of a continuum as a line, on the far edge of the line are the people who want to blow us up. Behind them is a slightly larger number of people who are supporting them. In total, they are a small proportion of the British Muslim community. In absolute terms, they're a terrifying number, but in proportion of the Muslim community in Britain, they're a very small number. The vast majority would not go there. However, that does not mean the vast majority are moderate. On the contrary. Among the people on the continuum, the vast majority who would not go down the road of terrorism or violence are people who believe variously or together the following precepts: that Islam is that the West is a conspiracy to destroy Islam, run by America; that the Jews are the puppet masters of the West; that we should live under Sharia; that the Muslims should live under Sharia law; that Israel is an illegitimate state founded by European Jews being plonked in the middle of a country called Palestine, which was historically the country of Muslims and Arabs. Now, instead of facing this down, this mindset of error and propaganda and lies and hatred, our political and security establishment has been instinctively an appeaser. It believes, fundamentally, the problem is this: it believes that all terrorism across the world, and Islamist terrorism is no different. It believes that all terrorism is rooted in discrete, identifiable geopolitical grievances. Iraq, Israel, Palestine, Kashmir, Chechnya, Bosnia, cause of choice, but basically terrorism is linked to those things. And therefore the way you deal with Islamist terror, which is driven by all these things, is to solve the grievances. So thus we have our Prime Minister committing the absolute folly, which he's believed for many, many years, that if you solve Israel-Palestine, you diffuse Muslim terror because you kind of draw the sting of Muslim rage. And in my view, it's completely the other way around. You can only solve the Israel impasse as you can only solve the war in Iraq and other conflicts around the world in which Islamists are involved if, first of all, you destroy Islamist terror. And it's that way around, not the other way around. However, our establishment doesn't get this, and as a result, it's had a strategy to combat Islamist terrorism in Britain by tackling what it calls the underlying causes, which it defines as our foreign policy, discrimination, poverty, Islamophobia, and all the rest of it. So we now have, for example, Sharia-compliant mortgages, a great advance. We have a government which put a toe in the water some time ago and said we must stop forced marriages. I mean, 14-year-old girls being basically taken to Pakistan and elsewhere to form marriages is an abomination to us. We all agree, but they've now withdrawn from that. We're not going to have any legislation to stop this because in case it offends the Muslim community. And perhaps most remarkably of all, we have our police talking now about making their own intelligence on terrorism available to certain selected representatives of the Muslim community before the police undertake any terrorist raids in order to get their approval and consent. We have brought radical Muslims into the very heart of government as advisors, people who subscribe to the tenets of the Muslim Brotherhood, to Hizb ut-Tahrir, and we have allowed or are allowing an enormous mosque to be the largest mosque in Europe apparently, seating some, 40 to 70,000 people, to be built on the site of the Freudian slip, of the Olympic Village, so that when Britain hosts the Olympics in 2012, next to the Olympic Stadium, when people come to see what Britain has on display as its great sort of cultural excitement, and this is what Britain's all about, next to the Olympic Stadium will be a mosque, the largest mosque in Europe. What a statement that will be. Worse still, this mosque is being funded by the Tablighi Jamaat. The Tablighi Jamaat is said by the FBI and French intelligence to be the antechamber to Al-Qaeda and the most significant recruiters to Al-Qaeda in Europe. There is virtually no discussion about this in Britain. No planning authorities have raised an eyebrow. There have been no members of parliament leaping up and down. The government is silent. That's the problem. Why have we got this problem? Well, I've written a whole book about this, and I've only got about 3 seconds left, so I will make it brief. The fundamental problem is that in Britain, we've simply lost the national plot. For the last 3-4 decades, we've been hollowing out the whole notion of British national identity and values, which have created a kind of vacuum into which radical Islam has seen its opportunity and poured in. Britain has quite simply, and I'm talking about the elites, not about the people. There is a great gulf now in Britain between leaders and led. But among the elites, the political elite, we have lost belief in ourselves as a nation, and indeed in the idea of the nation itself. We tell ourselves that because the nation is rooted in particulars of a history, a language, institutions, a religion, a culture, because it's particular, people who come from elsewhere feel aggrieved that they can't immediately share into this. And therefore the nation is illegitimate. The nation produces strife. The only legitimate polity is the supranational polity. So in Britain we now think legitimacy resides not in Britain but in supranational institutions and laws such as the United Nations, the European Union, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, European Court of Human Rights, and so on. And this is part of a drive to destroy and remake the British nation and culture through the doctrine of multiculturalism, the doctrine that says a majority culture is illegitimate because it's rooted in particulars. The only legitimate culture is a multiculture in which all values of minorities must be given equal status to those of the majority. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that is a way of destroying a majority culture. One of the side effects of this is that fact that you can't then integrate immigrants. If you think about it for 2 seconds, if you want to integrate immigrants, and most immigrants, including many Muslims, wish to integrate, they find when they come to Britain there's nothing to integrate into. They find that our institutions, our schools are saying, we celebrate your culture. Your identity is rooted in where you came from. That is your integrity. And we're going to celebrate your culture. Our culture is rubbish. And anyway, it doesn't really exist. So they've got nothing to hang on to. Now, this has had many, many lethal effects. One of the most lethal, in fact, the most lethal, is on young Muslim men who are stranded between cultures for various reasons. And we have made it even more difficult for them to get a handle on something sensible and good to hang on to.